Let's talk about 536 AD, hands down the worst year to be alive. It was literally the darkest year in human history. A volcanic eruption choked the skies with spite, plunging the world into a dark, cold, slow-motion hell where starvation and disease killed off millions. Nobody knew it at the time, but they were almost equally screwed. Before we wade into this grim spectacle, a quick question. Do you like to unwind with weird but surprisingly relatable history? If so, tap that like button and subscribe, and let this ancient absurdity lull you to sleep. I'm also curious who else is out there choosing historical weirdness over Netflix. So let me know where you're tuning in from and what ungodly hour it is in your corner of the world. All right, it's time to settle in, dim the lights, and make history feel weirdly personal. You wake up expecting normal sunrise, instead find dim, eerie twilight that feels like the world's worst hangover. Except the only thing you drank last night was watered-down ale that tasted like regret. The light filtering through your window has this nauseating, bluish quality, like someone dimmed the universe's brightness settings to funeral parlor chic. You wonder how long you've slept, but there's no way to tell because you've never seen this hour before. The sun looks bluish and weak, like someone replaced it with a sad LED bulb running on dying batteries. This isn't the familiar bright disk that hurts when you stare at it. This is some pathetic imposter you can look at comfortably, which is both fascinating and absolutely terrifying. As Procopius will later write, the sun gave forth its light without brightness, capturing this cosmic joke with typical Byzantine understatement. You initially think it's an eclipse, and eclipses end, right? Your brain grasps for explanations that don't involve the world ending. You've heard eclipse stories from traveling merchants, and they always end with, "Then the sun came back." So you wait, counting heartbeats, trying to remember how long these things last when you realize you have no idea, because astronomical education wasn't exactly priority in your subsistence farming lifestyle. Hours pass with no change, and you realize you might be witnessing the apocalypse or having a stroke. The dim twilight continues with bureaucratic persistence, refusing to brighten no matter how desperately you stare at the sky. Your neighbors emerge wearing matching expressions of confused terror. That universal, "This seems bad, but I don't know why" look. Across every continent, people are having this exact same "what the hell" moment. In Constantinople, Byzantine citizens gather in streets, while market vendors squint at goods they can barely see. Chinese farmers stand in fields, staring skyward, wondering if the emperor pissed off cosmic forces. Irish monks have emergency theological discussions about whether this is the apocalypse they prepared for. Scandinavian warriors nod grimly. Their mythology actually warned about Fimbulwinter, though they expected more dramatic battles. Is this a prequel to Ragnarok? A massive volcanic eruption has just told the entire planet to go sit in the corner and think about what it's done, though nobody alive has any clue what caused this. The closest thing to explanation you have is blaming God's wrath, angry spirits, or cosmic bookkeeping errors. Even people way smarter than you think this freak of nature moment happened because someone important made the gods very, very cranky. By noon, you're staring at a sun that looks like the moon decided to cosplay as daylight. What should be the blazing peak of day feels more like the world's most persistent dawn, complete with that eerie quality that makes your skin crawl for reasons you can't name. The familiar rhythm of bright morning, blazing noon, and gentle evening has been replaced by this monotonous twilight that refuses to follow any rules you understand. Time becomes elastic and meaningless when the sun won't cooperate with basic concepts like getting brighter at midday. You find yourself constantly looking up, waiting for some sign of change, but the sky just stares back with the indifference of a government clerk processing your suffering with extreme efficiency. People are gathering in streets and marketplaces, all wearing that universal expression of bewildered dread, like commuters on a subway where the train abruptly stops and the lights go out. Market vendors hold up pottery and fabric closer to their faces, trying to determine colors and quality in this bizarre half-light that makes everything look like it's been dipped in melancholy. The sounds of normal haggling and market chatter become muted, replaced by confused murmurs and the occasional frustrated curse when someone realizes they can't tell silk from sackcloth in this godforsaken lighting. Children are asking questions that make your soul hurt in ways you didn't know were possible. Mommy, why is the sun broken? And Daddy, when will it get better? These innocent inquiries hit like tiny daggers because you realize you have absolutely no answers that won't terrify them further. The universal parental response kicks in. Maintain calm exterior while internally screaming about this celestial freak show and your complete inability to fix anything. Adults exchange those meaningful looks across market squares and village greens, the kind that translate to, "We have absolutely no idea what's happening, but let's not tell the children that civilization might be ending before lunch." Some parents try deflecting with activities. Let's go gather firewood. Anything to keep small hands busy while avoiding questions about whether the world is permanently broken. Religious leaders across every culture spring into action, because clearly all the gods or whoever's in charge of heavenly maintenance is having some kind of supernatural mood swing. In Constantinople, priests organize emergency prayer sessions with the frantic energy of customer service representatives trying to handle a complaint they don't understand. The assumption that unprecedented weirdness requires immediate divine consultation leads to religious overtime that would be touching if it weren't so completely ineffective against atmospheric disasters. In rural China, local magistrates frantically dispatch messengers to the capital with reports that essentially translate to "the sky has fallen, and we're all probably doomed. Please send instructions and possibly wine." Chinese farmers abandon their tools in fields, convinced that the emperor has somehow lost the mandate of heaven through divine incompetence or paperwork errors. The Confucian worldview, which depends on natural order reflecting political order, suddenly makes about as much sense as using a fish to hammer nails. Irish monks immediately recognize this as apocalypse material and start praying harder than they've ever prayed in their lives, which honestly seems like a reasonable response given the circumstances. Monasteries become impromptu crisis centers where communities gather to collectively worry while chanting. The Irish, already familiar with harsh weather and tough times, adapt to supernatural weirdness with the resignation of people who have learned to expect the universe to have bad days. Meanwhile, Scandinavian warriors nod grimly because their mythology actually prepared them for this exact scenario. Norse traditions warned about Fimbulwinter, the great winter that precedes Ragnarok. And while the details are fuzzy, sun acts weird, everything gets cold, world probably ends, seems to match current conditions perfectly. They start sharpening weapons for invisible enemies, because at least their worldview included otherworldly disasters in the instruction manual. Even if the instructions were written by poets who valued dramatic flair over practical survival advice. By day 3, you've moved from "this is weird" to "we might actually be screwed." A psychological journey that everyone across the known world is taking at roughly the same pace. The realization dawns that this isn't going away anytime soon, and your mental preparation shifts from "wait it out" to "figure out how to live with this." Unfortunately, nobody has a user manual for what to do when the sun forgets how to be the sun. Your eyes are constantly straining in this perpetual twilight, giving you headaches that feel like your brain is filing a formal complaint with management about working conditions. What should be routine activities, reading, sewing, identifying food that's gone bad, now require squinting concentration that leaves you exhausted by what passes for evening. The human eye wasn't designed for weeks of dimness, and your pupils are working overtime like understaffed factory workers during a crisis. People who have never had vision problems before find themselves holding objects at arm's length, desperately angling them toward whatever pathetic light is available. Sleep becomes impossible because your body has no idea when day ends or begins. It's like permanent jet lag without the exotic destination or expensive airline food. Your internal clock, which has relied on sunrise and sunset for your entire existence, throws up its hands in defeat and stops providing any useful guidance about when to be awake or unconscious. You find yourself lying in bed during what might be night, staring at the ceiling and wondering if you should be sleeping or starting your day, while your confused brain cycles through every possible sleep hormone combination like a pharmacist having a nervous breakdown. Vitamin D deficiency hits faster than a lone shark collecting debts, bringing bone pain and muscle weakness that makes every movement feel like you're aging in fast forward. Your skeleton starts aching in ways that suggest your bones are personally offended by the lack of proper sunlight. Muscles that used to work reliably now feel like they're made of wet rope, and climbing stairs becomes an aerobic adventure that leaves you winded and questioning your life choices. This isn't just being tired. This is your body systematically shutting down non-essential services to conserve energy for basic survival. The seasonal depression symptoms hit populations like a plague of sadness, affecting communities that never experienced winter blues because they never had winters this severe or summers this absent. Entire cultures that built their worldview around predictable seasonal cycles now face emotional weather they don't have vocabulary for. You wake up feeling like someone drained your enthusiasm through a straw, and the perpetual gloom makes every task feel insurmountable, like trying to clean your house while wearing oven mitts. Morning routines are destroyed because there's no sunrise to mark morning. Time becomes a meaningless concept when your most reliable alarm clock decides to malfunction permanently. You wake up in the same dim twilight you went to sleep in, with no way to tell if you've slept for 2 hours or 12. The familiar rhythm that structured your entire existence, wake at dawn, work during daylight, rest at sunset, has been replaced by a continuous gray sameness that makes every hour feel identical. Your body's natural schedule, refined over decades of predictable patterns, now operates like a broken clock that's occasionally right by accident. Your washing water freezes overnight, even indoors, turning basic hygiene into an archaeological dig where you chip ice from basins with whatever tools you can find. The simple act of cleaning your face becomes a strategic operation requiring planning, preparation, and a tolerance for water so cold it makes your teeth ache. Personal cleanliness, once a matter of routine maintenance, transforms into a luxury you can barely afford when every drop of liquid water is precious, and heating it requires fuel you don't have. The smell of unwashed bodies becomes the universal perfume of survival, though nobody complains because everyone reeks equally. Work becomes impossible across every profession. Artisans can't see for detailed tasks. Farmers can't work frozen ground that rings like iron when struck with tools. Merchants have nothing worthwhile to trade because supply chains collapse faster than dominoes in an earthquake. The economic foundation of society, built on people doing specialized jobs and trading the results, crumbles when basic visibility and mobility disappear. Jewelers squint hopelessly at tiny gems. Scribes hold parchments inches from their faces trying to write by feel. And weavers abandon half-finished cloth because they can't distinguish colors or see the patterns they're creating. Bathhouses close because fuel is now more precious than gold. And suddenly, everyone smells like medieval defeat, mixed with the distinctive aroma of people who have given up on soap. The social centers where communities gathered to gossip, conduct business, and maintain the basic hygiene that separated civilization from barbarism become cold, empty buildings that mock the idea of luxury. The closing of public baths marks the end of social rituals that held communities together, leaving people isolated in their individual struggles against cold and darkness. Schools shut down because reading in this light is like trying to read underwater with your eyes closed during an earthquake. Education, already a privilege for the few, becomes completely impossible when teachers can't see their students and students can't see books. The transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next, which is the foundation of human progress, grinds to a halt. Children who should be learning letters and numbers instead learn to identify edible bark and calculate how long stored food might last. Street crime increases because criminals realize perpetual twilight is basically nature's gift to theft, turning every hour into the perfect conditions for activities that benefit from poor visibility. Law enforcement becomes nearly impossible when you can't see a pickpocket until they're close enough to shake hands. And pursuing criminals in dim light through familiar streets that now feel like alien landscapes becomes an exercise in futility. The social contract that keeps communities functioning breaks down when the honest couldn't guard their grain and the desperate turned thief. With no law, no light, and no bread, survival became a crime. The air starts smelling like smoke and desperation as everyone burns anything combustible they can find. Furniture legs, roof thatch, books, anything that might provide a few precious hours of warmth. The acrid smoke from impromptu fires carries the scent of things that shouldn't be burning. Leather shoes, wooden bowls, family heirlooms sacrificed to the desperate mathematics of survival. Every breath tastes of charred wood mixed with the bitter tang of burned cloth and the sweet-sick smell of melting wax from candles being used as kindling. The smell becomes so pervasive that you stop noticing it, which is both a mercy and a sign that you're adapting to conditions no human should have to adapt to. If you think the smell of strange items burning is bad enough, try mixing it with the funk of unwashed bodies and clothes that would make a skunk reconsider its life choices. Soap becomes a luxury memory, and hot water transforms into theoretical concept rather than daily reality. As the normal rhythm of bathing and washing clothes disappears when every scrap of fuel goes toward not freezing to death. People smell like anxiety mixed with wood smoke, their clothes stiff with accumulated grime and the distinctive aroma of wool that's been worn too long without cleaning. The social embarrassment of body odor vanishes when everyone shares the same aromatic tragedy, creating an egalitarian stench that transcends class boundaries. Waste disposal becomes problematic as normal systems freeze or become inaccessible, adding a sewage accent to the apocalypse that makes every gathering feel like a poorly planned camping trip organized by someone who hates humanity. Latrines freeze solid, chamber pots become unusable ice sculptures, and the normal infrastructure for human waste management collapses along with everything else. The medieval world, already challenged in the sanitation department, descends into conditions that would make a stable seem hygienic by comparison. The smell of human waste mingles with smoke and fear, creating an atmospheric reminder that civilization is only a few missed meals away from barbarism. The scent of fear sweat becomes the universal cologne of 536, as everyone's body chemistry shifts into permanent panic mode and stress hormones create their own distinctive perfume. This isn't the clean sweat of honest labor or physical exertion. This is the rank, sour smell of people whose fight or flight response has been activated for weeks with no resolution in sight. The psychological terror of not knowing when or if this nightmare will end expresses itself through every pore, creating a shared aromatic experience that bonds communities through mutual suffering and collective anxiety about whether tomorrow will be worse than today. You're trapped in small spaces with family members who are also slowly losing their minds, creating a pressure cooker of interpersonal tension that would make reality TV producers take notes. The cozy home that once felt comfortable now feels like a prison cell where everyone knows each other's worst habits, and nobody can escape for privacy. Unless you don't mind slowly turning into a human popsicle outside, then you can have all the privacy you want. Arguments break out over trivial things: who used the last candle, why someone breathed too loudly, whether that mysterious sound outside was wolves or just the wind. These aren't normal family squabbles. These are the desperate friction sparks of people whose survival instincts are fighting against their social conditioning. Children stop asking when the sun will return and start just staring at you with accusatory silence that somehow feels worse than all their questions combined. Their innocent trust in adult competence crumbles as they realize their parents have no more idea what's happening than they do, creating a household dynamic where the traditional authority structure collapses under the weight of shared helplessness. The children's eyes carry a new weight, not just confusion, but the dawning awareness that the adults who are supposed to protect them are just as scared and clueless as everyone else. This silent judgment feels heavier than any tantrum because it represents the death of childhood security in real time. Marriages strain under the pressure as couples argue over resource allocation like divorce lawyers in hell, with every decision about food, fuel, or water becoming a potential relationship-ending disagreement. The romantic partnership that worked fine during normal times becomes a business negotiation, where both parties are desperate, frightened, and running out of things to bargain with. Do you burn the wedding chest for warmth, or save it and risk freezing? Do you eat the last of the stored grain now, or stretch it another week and watch the children get thinner? These impossible choices turn loving spouses into suspicious strangers who eye each other's portions and wonder if their partner is hiding supplies. Decision-making becomes paralyzed because traditional authority figures have no answers either, leaving families rudderless in decisions both trivial and life-threatening. The village elder who usually settles disputes admits he's never seen anything like this. The local priest offers prayers, but no practical solutions. The merchant who always knew the best trade routes has nowhere to go because all the routes lead to the same problem. Without reliable leadership or precedent to follow, every family becomes its own failed democracy, where nobody knows enough to make good decisions, or any decisions at all. Extended families forced together create interpersonal conflicts that make holiday dinners look peaceful by comparison. As relatives who usually saw each other occasionally now share cramped quarters with constant exposure to personality clashes and old grievances. The aunt who was merely annoying during brief visits becomes unbearable when you're stuck with her constant complaining for weeks. The cousin who borrowed money 2 years ago and never paid it back now expects to share your dwindling food supplies. Family grudges that seemed manageable during normal times explode into bitter feuds when resources are scarce and tempers run high, creating internal warfare within the very groups that need to cooperate for survival. By month 1, you're accepting that this might be the new normal, which somehow feels worse than thinking it's temporary, because it means abandoning hope for rescue and starting to plan for permanent misery. The psychological shift from emergency mode to this is just life now changes everything about how families function, forcing them to create new rules, new hierarchies, and new ways of relating to each other that assume the world has fundamentally changed forever. The family unit, once built around shared comfort and mutual support, transforms into a survival collective where love must compete with the basic mathematics of who eats first when there isn't enough food for everyone. World temperatures drop 2.5 degrees globally, which sounds small until you realize your olive oil is now a sad, inedible popsicle. This isn't just getting chilly. This is nature delivering a meteorological slap to the face that makes every previous winter look like a tropical vacation. The volcanic ash-blocking sunlight creates a planetary refrigerator where most things that used to be liquid decide to become solid. And what was already solid before this frozen hellscape becomes harder than your landlord's heart. Your breath starts forming clouds indoors, which would be charming if it weren't a sign that your living space has joined the ranks of walk-in freezers. Mediterranean regions that never saw snow suddenly become winter wonderlands that nobody asked for, hosting impromptu ice festivals where the main attraction is not dying from exposure. Olive groves that have flourished for centuries watch their precious trees crack and split as sap freezes inside the bark, creating sounds like gunshots echoing across the countryside. Vineyard owners stare in horror as grapevines that survived Roman conquests and barbarian invasions finally meet their match in volcanic winter. Generations of careful cultivation destroyed faster than you can say climate disaster. The irony isn't lost on anyone that regions famous for sun-drenched agriculture are now competing with Northern Europe for most likely to kill you with cold. Water pipes crack from frost like nature's own home demolition service, turning basic plumbing into an archaeological puzzle where every drop of liquid water becomes more precious than gold. The infrastructure that civilized communities depend on simply wasn't designed for temperatures this extreme, creating a cascade of failures that transform routine water access into survival challenges. Stone and clay pipes that worked reliably for generations split open when water inside them freezes and expands, leaving settlements without functioning water systems just when they need them most. People wake up to discover their carefully maintained water sources have become useless ice sculptures, forcing them to develop entirely new methods for obtaining the liquid they need to survive. Your summer wardrobe becomes about as useful as a chocolate teapot in an ice storm, leaving you layering every piece of clothing you own and still shivering like a nervous chihuahua. The lightweight tunics and sandals that worked perfectly for Mediterranean summers now mock you from storage chests, while you wrap yourself in every available fabric, creating fashion statements that prioritize survival over style. People start wearing multiple layers of everything, looking like walking textile collections where the primary design principle is, will this prevent death by freezing? The concept of seasonal clothing completely breaks down when every season becomes winter, and fashion becomes a matter of creative layering rather than aesthetic choice. Elderly and infants start dying within days from cold exposure, because 536 doesn't believe in gentle learning curves or mercy for the vulnerable. The human body, designed to function within specific temperature ranges, simply shuts down when faced with sudden cold that sustains and overwhelms its heating systems. Families watch helplessly as grandparents and babies succumb to hypothermia in their own homes, creating a grim lesson in human physiology that nobody wanted to learn. The death toll from cold exposure rivals what wars and plagues accomplish, except this enemy can't be fought with weapons or medicine, only endured with whatever fuel and shelter you can scrape together before your body gives up the fight against physics. Livestock that survived millennia of normal winters die overnight from unexpected freezing, turning pastoral scenes into frozen graveyards where sheep and cattle become ice sculptures in fields. Animals that evolved to handle seasonal cold find themselves completely overwhelmed by temperatures that drop faster than their metabolism can adjust. Shepherds wake up to discover entire flocks dead in pastures, their wool coated with frost and their bodies rigid as wooden planks. The economic disaster of losing livestock compounds the food crisis, as communities lose not just their immediate protein sources, but also their breeding stock for future years, creating a cascade of hunger that will outlast the volcanic winter itself. Wells freeze for the first time in living memory, forcing families to walk miles for water like refugees in their own homeland. The reliable water sources that anchored settlements for generations become useless ice monuments, turning hydration into a dangerous expedition through hostile weather. People develop elaborate rituals around water collection, melting snow and ice in precious containers, while calculating how much fuel they can afford to spend on the luxury of liquid water. The phrase "water is life" stops being metaphorical and becomes mathematical reality as communities ration every drop like medicine for the dying. And arguments break out over who gets the cleanest snow to melt. Stone houses become ice-cold chambers that make refrigerators seem cozy, as thermal mass that once provided comfortable shelter now works against inhabitants by absorbing and holding the bitter cold. The thick walls that protected families from summer heat become prison walls that trap frigid air, creating indoor temperatures that rival the hostile world outside. People huddle together in single rooms, abandoning most of their homes to conserve whatever warmth they can generate through body heat and pathetic fires. The architecture designed for Mediterranean climate becomes a cruel joke, as building materials optimized for staying cool in summer prove spectacularly unsuited for surviving volcanic winter. Traditional heating methods prove as effective as spitting at this atmospheric middle finger nature is giving everyone, as fireplaces designed for occasional use become woefully inadequate against sustained supernatural cold. Wood supplies that might last a normal winter disappear in summer weeks, when every waking moment requires fire for survival rather than comfort. People huddle around hearths that produce more smoke than warmth, watching flames that barely heat a few feet of space, while the rest of their homes remain frozen wastelands. The realization dawns that human heating technology, impressive enough for normal weather, is basically medieval compared to the forces that just decided to relocate the Arctic to everywhere simultaneously. Northern Europeans who thought they knew cold discover they were basically amateur hour compared to volcanic winter's professional-grade misery. These are people who bragged about their hardy northern blood and mocked southern Europeans for wearing cloaks in mild weather, only to find themselves trembling like scared rabbits when real cold shows up to the party uninvited. Scandinavian warriors who once stripped to the waist in snowstorms for dramatic effect now huddle under every available fur, realizing their previous toughness was just cosplay compared to nature's actual winter collection. The traditional Viking approach of just be more manly than the weather proves about as effective as threatening a blizzard with a strongly worded letter. Chinese populations flee southward, believing northern regions are cursed by dragons having a particularly bad century, creating refugee streams of people who packed their entire lives into whatever they could carry. Entire villages empty overnight as families abandon homes their ancestors built, convinced that staying means certain death and fleeing south offers hope of survival. The Great Migration creates a human traffic jam of desperate people, all heading toward regions that are also cold, but maybe slightly less apocalyptic. Roadways become clogged with carts, livestock, and people carrying children who don't understand why they're walking away from everything they've ever known toward an uncertain future that might be marginally less horrible. Coastal communities watch harbors freeze solid, cutting off transportation and trade like economic blood clot that paralyzes entire regions. Ships become trapped in ice so thick you could walk across harbors, turning mighty vessels into expensive lawn ornaments that mock the concept of maritime commerce. Port cities that built their entire identity around being gateways to the world suddenly find themselves as isolated as mountain villages, watching their economic lifelines turn into skating rinks nobody asked for. The irony isn't lost on anyone that communities surrounded by water are now experiencing drought conditions because all that water decided to become decorative ice sculptures instead of staying usefully liquid. Shepherds abandon flocks as animals die too quickly to save, creating pastoral graveyards across Europe, where sheep become frozen monuments to agricultural failure. The economic mathematics become brutally simple when animals are dying faster than you can process them for food, forcing herders to make the heartbreaking choice between staying with dying livestock or fleeing to save themselves. Shepherds who have spent their entire lives protecting animals from wolves and weather find themselves helpless against an enemy that kills entire flocks overnight, turning pastoral occupations into exercises in futility. The countryside fills with the eerie silence of abandoned farms, where the only sounds are wind whistling through empty barns and the occasional crack of frozen wood splitting in the cold. Constant chopping sounds echo everywhere as people desperately cut any wood for fuel, creating a percussion section for the apocalypse that never takes a break from performing. The rhythmic thudding of axes against wood becomes the heartbeat of survival. As every household tries to stay ahead of fuel consumption that outpaces supply by margins that would make lone sharks seem generous. Trees that took decades to grow disappear in days, turned into firewood that burns through faster than political promises during election season. The sound of splitting wood becomes so constant that silence actually feels ominous, because it means someone has either found a better fuel source, given up entirely, or frozen to death while still holding their axe in a final act of defiant optimism. The cracking of trees dying from cold creates a soundtrack like the world's skeleton breaking, as ancient oaks and sturdy pines split apart with sounds that echo through forests like gunshots in a library. Trees that survived centuries of storms, droughts, and human stupidity finally meet their match in volcanic winter, their sap freezing solid and expanding, until bark explodes with sharp reports that make everyone jump. The forest becomes a concert hall for destruction, where nature provides its own sound effects for the end of the world. Walking through wooded areas becomes like navigating a war zone where the enemy is physics, and the casualties are every living thing with roots. Domestic animals bleat and moo in distress, creating a chorus of confused suffering that sounds like a barnyard having a collective nervous breakdown. Cows that used to graze contentedly now make sounds like they're auditioning for a tragedy they never wanted to star in, while sheep huddle together making noises that sound suspiciously like group therapy sessions for traumatized livestock. Horses whinny with the desperation of creatures who trusted humans to provide adequate shelter and are now questioning that life choice. The once comforting barnyard chorus devolves into an a cappella of doom, as creatures that depend on humans for care find themselves sharing the same desperate circumstances as their increasingly unreliable caretakers. Wind sounds become more noticeable without normal animal and farming activity, like nature providing commentary on the emptiness where civilization used to make noise. The constant whoosh and moan of air moving through abandoned settlements creates an atmospheric soundtrack that would be peaceful if it weren't so obviously filling the silence left by mass death and migration. Wind that used to blend with human voices, animal sounds, and working machinery now dominates the audio landscape like a lonely radio station, broadcasting nothing but atmospheric dread. The wind holds the stage until it's joined by the restless shuffle of migrating feet. Footsteps of refugees constantly passing through settlements create the audio signature of a civilization in motion, as people trek through towns seeking anywhere warmer with the persistence of ants rebuilding after someone kicked their hill. The steady trudge of feet, wheels, and hooves creates a migration soundtrack that never stops day or night, as streams of desperate people flow through communities like human rivers seeking lower ground. Children's voices mix with adult conversations in languages from regions hundreds of miles away, creating a Babel of displacement where everyone is going somewhere else, because staying put means certain death. The sound of constant movement becomes the new normal, replacing the stable sounds of settled communities with the restless audio of people who have nowhere left to call home. Once the echo of departing footfalls faded, eerie silence replaces what used to be normal street bustle as commerce and socializing just stop, creating quiet so profound it feels like someone turned down the volume on existence itself. The familiar sounds of daily life, marketplace chatter, children playing, craftsmen working, all vanish as if someone hit the mute button on civilization. Streets that once rang with conversation, laughter, and the general chaos of human activity now echo only with footsteps that sound unnaturally loud in the emptiness. The silence becomes oppressive and unnatural, making survivors feel like they're living in a world that's been abandoned by sound itself, where even breathing seems too loud, and every remaining noise carries further than it should in air that's forgotten how to absorb the sounds of normal life. You stare at fields where absolutely nothing grows despite planting, like the earth has gone on strike and decided to provide its own commentary on human optimism. The seeds that should have sprouted into life-sustaining crops instead become expensive bird food scattered across dirt that's about as fertile as a stone floor. Farmers who have worked the same land for generations find themselves standing in barren fields that mock decades of agricultural knowledge. Realizing this crisis has robbed them of their sustainable food source and left them powerless against forces beyond human control. The psychological impact of failed crops hits harder than the physical hunger, because it represents the moment when humanity realizes that nature has fundamentally changed the rules without providing an instruction manual. Stored grain from last year runs out faster than expected because nobody planned for the sun to quit working, turning careful winter preparations into cruel jokes about human foresight. The calculations that normally determine how much food to save versus consume assume normal growing seasons, not climate disasters that cancel agriculture indefinitely. Families watch their grain stores dwindle with the grim fascination of people watching an hourglass run out when they can't flip it over, knowing that each meal brings them closer to starvation, but unable to stop the mathematical inevitability. The realization dawns that even careful planning becomes meaningless when the fundamental assumptions about reality turn out to be wrong. Government grain distributions create riots as supplies dwindle, turning bread lines into medieval fight clubs where basic civility dies faster than the people waiting for food. The orderly systems designed to handle normal shortages collapse under pressure that exceeds every previous disaster, as officials trained to manage temporary hardships face permanent catastrophe with the effectiveness of lifeguards trying to stop a tsunami. People who once respected authority and waited their turn discover that politeness is a luxury they can no longer afford when their children are starving. The social contract dissolves into mob rule, where survival instincts override civilized behavior, creating scenes that would make barbarian invasions look like tea parties. Bread prices increase 1,000% in some markets, making carbohydrates more valuable than precious metals, and transforming bakeries into financial institutions that deal in life-sustaining commodities. The economic principles that normally govern commerce break down when supply disappears, but demand becomes literally a matter of life and death. Merchants find themselves accidentally becoming kings of their own small empires, holding power over who lives and dies based on who can afford increasingly impossible prices. The phrase "worth its weight in gold" becomes obsolete as bread becomes worth significantly more than gold, creating an economy where bakers have more power than nobles, and a single loaf can buy what used to purchase horses. Families start making impossible choices about who gets fed first, like a horrible game show where the contestants are your loved ones, and the prize is staying alive another day. The moral framework that holds families together crumbles under decisions that pit survival against love, creating psychological trauma that survivors will carry long after the volcanic winter ends. Parents look at their children and mentally calculate who has the best chance of surviving on reduced rations, while elderly family members quietly volunteer to eat less so younger generations might live. These aren't abstract ethical dilemmas discussed in philosophy classes, but daily reality, where every meal becomes a referendum on family hierarchy and the mathematical value of human life. You begin with leather goods, boiling shoes for nutrition, because footwear has officially joined the food pyramid as a source of questionable protein. The process involves hours of simmering tough leather until it becomes something resembling edible, creating soup that tastes like sadness seasoned with regret, and a hint of whatever the cow stepped in before becoming your boots. People develop elaborate recipes for making shoe leather palatable, adding whatever herbs they can find to mask the flavor of defeat and desperation. The irony isn't lost on anyone that the things designed to protect your feet from the ground are now protecting your stomach from complete emptiness, though both forms of protection are equally inadequate. Pet consumption starts quietly as neighborhood cats begin traveling to mysterious destinations that coincidentally correspond with the locations of cooking fires. The beloved house cats and loyal dogs that once provided companionship find themselves being eyed with the calculating gaze usually reserved for livestock, as survival instincts override emotional attachments with ruthless efficiency. Families who would have died to protect their pets 6 months ago now engage in elaborate mental gymnastics to justify why Fluffy's sacrifice serves the greater good of keeping children alive. The transition from family member to emergency protein source happens gradually, with pets disappearing one by one until neighborhoods become eerily quiet of the animal sounds that once provided comfort. Seed grain gets eaten out of desperation, destroying any hope of future harvests in the ultimate self-sabotage that trades tomorrow's survival for today's meal. The seeds carefully saved for spring planting become this week's dinner, as families face the impossible choice between starving now or starving later, with the added bonus of having no crops to look forward to. Farmers who spent generations building seed stocks watch their agricultural future disappear into cooking pots, knowing they're essentially eating their own ability to recover from this disaster. The mathematical brutality becomes inescapable when eating your seed grain might keep you alive long enough to see spring, but guaranteeing you'll have nothing to plant if spring ever comes. People discover tree bark can be processed into flour, activating ancient famine knowledge like humanity's worst cookbook that only gets consulted during apocalyptic emergencies. The inner bark of certain trees becomes a carbohydrate source that tastes like wood because it literally is wood, requiring elaborate preparation to make it even remotely digestible. Communities share information about which trees are least likely to kill you when consumed, creating survival networks where recipe exchanges focus on ways to prepare inedible things without dying immediately. The process of harvesting and preparing bark flour becomes a cottage industry of desperation, as people strip trees bare in their search for anything that might provide calories without providing death. Clay consumption becomes normalized because filling your stomach with dirt beats filling it with air seasoned with hopelessness and the distant memory of actual food. The human digestive system, never designed to process soil, struggles with this geological diet while providing the psychological comfort of feeling full even when no actual nutrition is being absorbed. People develop preferences for different types of clay based on texture and perceived mineral content. Since nobody ran lab tests to verify nutritional value, all recommendations came from gut feeling, literally gut feeling, plus that particular clay's street cred. The practice spreads through communities like a bizarre trend, where everyone pretends that eating earth is a reasonable solution to hunger, because the alternative is admitting that civilization has completely collapsed, and they're all slowly starving to death, while maintaining the polite fiction that consuming soil counts as a meal. Chinese populations dust off ancient famine survival guides, turning tree bark flour into sophisticated survival cuisine that would make modern survival shows look like amateur hour. The Chinese approach bark preparation with the methodical precision of people who have survived famines before and documented exactly how to do it again, creating recipes that transform inedible wood into something approaching actual food. Historical records from the Ming Dynasty's materia medica for famine relief get consulted like cookbook Bibles, as families follow instructions for stripping inner bark from elms and grinding it into flour that tastes like regret but provides actual calories. The Chinese don't just eat bark, they engineer it into a food system, mixing it with whatever else they can find to create meals that keep people alive, rather than just filling their stomachs with wood fiber. Irish monasteries become medieval Amazon warehouses, distributing stored grain, while monks silently judge everyone's life choices, and probably keeping detailed records of who owes what favors when civilization recovers. The monastic communities that spent years accumulating grain stores suddenly find themselves the most popular institutions in Europe, as desperate families arrive with starving children begging for any food the brothers can spare. Monks who took vows of poverty now control more wealth than nobles, measured in grain rather than gold, while maintaining the moral high ground by actually helping people instead of hoarding supplies like secular authorities. The monasteries become regional food distribution centers, where spiritual salvation comes with a side of actual salvation from starvation. Coastal communities discover seaweed tastes like ocean sadness, but beats starving to death with dignity, expanding their marine harvesting beyond fish to include anything the sea produces that won't immediately kill them. The Irish, already familiar with kelp and various sea vegetables, become experts at transforming oceanic plant life into barely edible sustenance that provides nutrients missing from land-based famine foods. Communities develop elaborate methods for processing different types of seaweed, removing salt and toxins while preserving whatever nutritional value exists in plants that evolved underwater. Coastal populations gain a survival advantage over inland communities, turning their proximity to the ocean from a fishing convenience into a lifeline that connects them to food sources unaffected by the atmospheric disaster. Scandinavians hunt seals because apparently seals didn't starve as bad as cows, expanding their marine mammal harvesting to industrial levels as land-based food sources disappear. The Norse populations, already accustomed to harsh winters and marine-based subsistence, scale up their traditional seal hunting operations when agriculture becomes impossible. Their experience with ice, cold weather clothing, and marine hunting provides survival advantages that landlocked populations lack, turning their harsh homeland from a disadvantage into a relative blessing. The Scandinavians' cultural familiarity with suffering through long, dark winters gives them psychological resilience that helps them endure volcanic winter conditions that break populations unused to extended misery and seal-based diets. You ration candlelight like phone battery during a power outage, because apparently medieval families invented screen time limits centuries before screens existed. Every candle becomes a precious resource that gets calculated down to the minute, with your family developing elaborate schedules for when artificial light is absolutely necessary versus when you can stumble around in permanent twilight and hope for the best. The luxury of reading after dark becomes a distant memory as you realize that burning a candle for entertainment is essentially setting money on fire, when that money might mean the difference between seeing tomorrow or dying in darkness tonight. Candlelight rationing creates new social hierarchies, where the person controlling the flame's schedule wields power over everyone else's evening activities, turning simple illumination into a tool of domestic authority. Artisans create the world's first co-working spaces, as jewelers, scribes, weavers, and metalworkers abandon their individual workshops to pool their remaining candles and oil lamps in communal spaces, where 10 people sharing 5 candles can accomplish more than 10 people, each trying to work alone with half a candle. The collaborative workspace becomes less about social interaction and more about survival economics, where craftsmen take turns working on projects that require actual vision rather than educated guessing. These improvised workshops buzz with whispered conversations and the sounds of people carefully handling tools they can barely see, creating an atmosphere of concentrated effort mixed with the constant fear of ruining expensive materials through poor visibility. Irish monks become medieval Etsy sellers, cranking out beeswax candles while silently judging everyone's life choices and probably maintaining detailed records of who owes what favors when civilization recovers. The monasteries that stored beeswax for religious ceremonies suddenly find themselves running the only reliable candle manufacturing operations in Europe, turning spiritual communities into essential industry suppliers. Brothers who dedicated their lives to prayer ironically become wealthy in the new economy where light equals life, though they maintain their religious dignity by pretending this is all part of God's plan, rather than admitting they're basically running emergency lighting businesses. The production lines become prayer circles, where religious chanting provides rhythm for candle making, while brothers mentally calculate how much they can charge starving families without technically violating their spiritual commitments. Polished bronze mirrors turn homes into desperate solar panel imitations, reflecting light that barely qualifies as illumination, like ancient technology trying to solve modern problems. You position mirrors throughout your home with the obsessive care of people trying to perform surgery with a butter knife, attempting to capture and redirect whatever feeble sunlight manages to penetrate the volcanic gloom. The mirrors themselves become valuable commodities, as you realize that doubling dim light still provides more visibility than single dim light, creating a market for reflective surfaces, where polished metal costs more than the furniture it used to decorate. Your home transforms into an elaborate light-catching contraption, where every shiny surface gets repositioned daily to follow the sun's feeble journey across the sky. Rushlights made from reeds soaked in sheep fat become haute cuisine lighting, because nothing says fine dining like furniture that smells like wet farm animals and provides illumination roughly equivalent to a dying firefly with depression. The desperate search for lighting alternatives leads to creative solutions that work marginally better than complete darkness, while creating new problems involving toxic fumes and fire hazards that make every evening feel like a small-scale industrial accident waiting to happen. You become a connoisseur of different fat sources for rushlights, developing preferences for sheep fat versus goose fat versus whatever unfortunate animal recently died and might provide flammable rendering material. The rushlight economy creates cottage industries where families specialize in collecting reeds, processing animal fat, and assembling lighting devices that technically qualify as illumination, even though they provide roughly the same visibility as squinting really hard in a basement. 6 months have passed since the volcanic winter began, and the real winter is approaching to make things even more diabolic than they already are. There are no more trees left to cut down within miles around you, and after months of fuel scarcity, you've already gone through most combustible things. This forces you to develop increasingly creative heating solutions that range from ingenious to absolutely insane. Extended families stuff themselves into single heated rooms to maximize the efficiency of whatever heat sources they can still maintain, creating human heating systems where multiple generations share body warmth through strategic positioning and collective thermal management. The mathematics of group heating becomes a survival science where families calculate optimal sleeping arrangements, shared blankets, and rotation schedules that ensure everyone gets access to the warmest spots without anyone freezing to death during the night. These communal heating arrangements transform private family spaces into carefully orchestrated survival operations, where individual comfort becomes secondary to group thermal efficiency. Heated stones get passed around like the world's worst hot potato game, providing temporary warmth and permanent burns as your family develops elaborate systems for sharing thermal rocks that hold heat longer than human patience. The process involves heating stones near fires during the day, then wrapping them in cloth and rotating them through your family like medieval heating pads that occasionally explode from thermal shock. Children learn to handle hot stones with the dexterity of professional jugglers, while adults develop burn scars that map their dedication to staying warm through increasingly dangerous heating methods. You invite livestock indoors to share body heat, creating interior design schemes that smell like barnyard desperation, mixed with the distinctive aroma of animals who are just as confused about indoor living as their human roommates. Cows, sheep, and goats find themselves promoted from outdoor livestock to indoor heating appliances, though they prove about as cooperative with this career change as expected from creatures who prefer eating grass to sharing living quarters with humans. The traditional separation between animal and human living spaces collapses under the practical mathematics of survival, where large mammals generate more heat than humans, but also generate significantly more waste, noise, and existential questions about the boundaries of civilization. When you finally run out of things to burn and all else has failed, underground cellars become luxury penthouses, because even though they're technically colder, being protected from wind beats the alternative of turning into human popsicles above ground, while pretending surface living still makes sense. You abandon your main house to crowd into storage basements that were never designed for habitation, creating subterranean communities where root cellars become family homes and wine storage becomes bedroom space. The psychological adjustment to underground living proves easier than expected when surface temperatures make traditional housing uninhabitable, transforming these spaces into refuges that provide at least some protection from the relentless cold. Community-bred ovens operate 24/7 as unofficial warming centers where you bake questionable food substitutes and existential dread, while huddling around communal heat sources that provide both sustenance and sanity. The ovens that used to operate on baking schedules become continuous warming stations, where you and your neighbors take shifts maintaining fires, cooking whatever edible materials you can find, and sharing space with people who have temporarily set aside property disputes in favor of collective heat management. The community oven becomes the social center where you exchange survival information, trade resources, and engage in the kind of cooperation that normally takes disasters to inspire. Though in this case, the disaster is permanent enough to make cooperation feel less temporary and more like the foundation of a new social order based on shared warmth rather than shared prosperity. When physical solutions don't seem to make anything better, you switch strategies and try negotiating with whatever supernatural forces might be responsible for this atmospheric disaster. Scandinavian chieftains bury massive gold hoards hoping to buy the sun back from angry gods, sacrificing wealth that could feed villages for the slim chance that divine powers might accept payment for solar restoration. In Denmark, powerful leaders bury enormous treasures weighing nearly a kilogram, including saucer-sized bracteates and Roman coins repurposed as jewelry. These aren't ordinary offerings, but elite panic responses, where only the wealthiest can afford such desperate theology. The buried artifacts bear runes and imagery of the High One, later linked to Odin, suggesting you're appealing directly to the King of Gods when lesser deities have clearly stopped taking your calls. The decision to bury wealth instead of hoarding it reveals profound existential terror. Because when chieftains choose survival theology over personal enrichment, you know civilization has moved beyond normal crisis management into supernatural negotiation territory. This isn't just ritual, it's wealthy people literally buying lottery tickets for divine intervention. Though the fact that these treasures remain buried 15 centuries later suggests the gods either didn't care for your offerings, had nothing to do with it, or simply didn't exist. Whatever the reason, these rituals prove equally ineffective. Christian communities interpret the dimmed sun and crop failures as apocalyptic signs of divine punishment for collective sin, organizing mass spiritual responses when religious authorities fail to provide coherent explanations or clear guidance. You participate in widespread prayer, fasting, which is ironic since you're practically starving already, and confession sessions where communities assume they've angered God through unspecified group transgressions and seek forgiveness through communal repentance. This spiritual vacuum forces local communities to organize their own salvation rituals, desperately confessing everything from moral failings to heresies to social corruption, in hopes of identifying whatever triggered planetary scale divine wrath. Chinese populations perform elaborate dragon ceremonies because they believe dragons control rain, weather, and agricultural fertility. They are convinced bad weather happens because dragons are displeased at something, and appeasement can restore harmony. So you participate in rituals designed to coax dragons into releasing rain and sunlight, restoring balance to a world that feels fundamentally broken. The emperor, as son of heaven, leads or sanctions these ceremonies because his failure to maintain cosmic harmony is symbolically tied to the dragon's displeasure, making the rituals both spiritual appeals and political damage control. The ceremonial elements include dragon dances mimicking celestial movement, sacrifices at dragon altars, and invocations of the Dragon King through music, incense, and prayer. With regional variations featuring acrobatic performances in southern China and symbolic dragon boat rituals in coastal areas. Every culture develops increasingly desperate supernatural strategies, because when the physical world stops following basic rules, appealing to invisible authorities becomes the only remaining option for people who refuse to accept that some disasters are simply beyond human influence or divine negotiation. Divination obsession reaches addiction levels as you desperately seek predictions about when this nightmare ends. Consulting every fortune teller like checking weather apps during a hurricane. You visit astrologers, soothsayers, and anyone claiming supernatural insight into cosmic scheduling, hoping someone has insider information about when normal sunlight resumes. The demand creates a boom economy for people claiming divine connections, though their predictions prove worthless. You know they're probably frauds, but the psychological need for hope keeps you returning with the desperation of someone buying lottery tickets during economic collapse. Community scapegoating spikes, because clearly someone human is responsible for this mess. Probably that weird neighbor who never participated in community events and seems suspicious now. You join village meetings where people point fingers at anyone who displayed antisocial behavior or practiced unusual customs. When supernatural explanations fail, someone local must be collaborating with evil forces to maintain this nightmare. Accusations escalate from strange behavior to probably a witch faster than food prices increase, creating trials where social outcasts become convenient explanations for problems nobody understands. Traditional social rules collapse, making theft morally acceptable when legal authorities prove useless for addressing basic needs. You watch neighbors abandon the concept of property that worked during abundance, but becomes meaningless when everyone owns nothing worth stealing except scraps of food. The social contract dissolves into mob rule where survival instincts override civilized behavior. Stealing bread becomes heroism rather than crime. Legal systems designed for normal times prove inadequate for societies where morality conflicts with not dying. Religious fervor cranks up with apocalypse expectations, creating spiritual panic that makes physical suffering worse by adding psychological terror about eternal damnation. You participate in extreme religious observances where communities assume the end times have arrived and respond with frantic spiritual activity. Physical disaster confirms apocalyptic predictions, which inspire more desperate religious behavior, which reinforces beliefs about divine punishment, creating spiritual death spirals that make survival even harder through psychological breakdown. Despite all the efforts, nothing has improved. It has been over a year since your life was turned upside down, and the second harvest failure hits like a sequel nobody asked for, destroying whatever optimism survived the first round of agricultural apocalypse. You stare at fields that remain barren for the second year running, watching your neighbors' faces register the dawning horror that this isn't a temporary setback, but potentially permanent agricultural collapse. The psychological impact of consecutive crop disasters proves worse than actual starvation, because it destroys the fundamental assumption that next year will be better. Communities that managed to maintain hope through one failed growing season now face the mathematical certainty that stored food will run out before any new crops can possibly mature, creating community-wide existential breakdowns as you realize this might be humanity's new permanent address rather than a temporary crisis requiring endurance. Suicide rates spike among people who decided eternal winter wasn't worth the monthly rent on existence, creating a grim accounting where some families lose more members to intentional death than starvation or disease. You witness neighbors quietly disappearing rather than continuing to struggle against conditions that show no signs of improvement. The psychological toll of watching loved ones waste away while being powerless to help creates emotional weight so heavy it becomes unbearable. So some people choose permanent escape and sign out from living for good. Communities develop unspoken protocols for handling self-inflicted deaths that become common enough to require social customs nobody wanted to establish. The psychological whiplash of thinking, surely it can't get worse, followed immediately by discovering that yes, it can always get worse, creates mental exhaustion that rivals physical starvation for its ability to destroy human resilience. You experience the devastating cycle of building hope during brief moments when conditions seem stable, only to have that hope destroyed by new disasters that prove optimism is a luxury you can't afford during extended catastrophes. The constant emotional roller coaster between desperate hope and crushing disappointment wears down psychological defenses until you learn to expect the worst possible outcomes as protection against further mental trauma. This defensive pessimism becomes a survival strategy where assuming everything will fail prevents the additional pain of disappointed expectations on top of actual suffering. Perpetual twilight becomes standard operating procedure, like living inside a depressed Instagram filter forever. The dim lighting that originally terrified you now feels normal, and you've developed routines around noon looking like dawn. Your eyes have adapted to constant strain, and headaches from poor visibility are as routine as breathing. Children born during this period never saw proper sunlight, and you don't know if they ever will. This creates a generation whose normal includes conditions that would have seemed apocalyptic to their parents. Cold weather survival transforms from emergency camping trip to basic life skills. The heated stone rotations, livestock sharing living spaces, and underground sleeping we discussed earlier have become standard household management rather than crisis responses. You no longer think of these as temporary measures, but as how humans live now. Communities have developed expertise in techniques that used to be last resort measures, turning emergency heating into refined systems that parents teach children as basic life skills. Tree bark cooking transitions from desperate measure to family recipe passed down through traumatized generations. You now know which trees provide the best flour substitutes, how to process clay for nutrition, and which combinations create meals that taste less like defeat. The elaborate preparation methods for inedible materials have become culinary traditions where families compete over who makes the best acorn bread. What started as eating anything to avoid starvation has evolved into a parallel food culture where bark flour recipes get shared like normal cooking techniques. Community resource sharing replaces individual ownership, creating socialist societies through volcanic coercion rather than political theory. You participate in resource distribution networks where personal property has become a quaint concept that died with abundance. The informal sharing arrangements that began as emergency cooperation have become sophisticated systems for managing scarcity based on need and survival mathematics rather than ownership rights. Individual hoarding seems not just selfish, but actively stupid. Crisis management becomes civilization's primary skill set, proving humans can adapt to literally anything given sufficient terror. You live in settlements where everyone knows how to process questionable food, maintain heating systems that barely work, and organize resource distribution during permanent scarcity. The crisis response techniques that once seemed extraordinary have become routine administrative knowledge, where village elders teach crisis management like previous generations taught normal trade skills. 18 months of darkness creates mass psychological trauma because human brains weren't designed for vampire lifestyle, turning sleep disruption into chronic mental health crisis that affects entire populations. You experience cognitive breakdown that goes beyond initial sleep problems, as prolonged darkness destroys your brain's ability to regulate mood, memory, and decision-making. Communities struggle with psychological effects that worsen over time, creating societies where mental illness becomes as common as physical hunger. The human mind begins breaking down in ways that make survival decisions increasingly difficult even when physical resources are available. Sleep disruption epidemics spread like viral insomnia, creating populations of walking zombies who can't die properly because their bodies have forgotten how to rest effectively. You find yourself awake for days followed by collapsing into unconsciousness at inappropriate times, while your neighbors experience similar breakdowns that make coordinated community activities nearly impossible. People fall asleep while tending fires, preparing food, or performing other survival-critical tasks, creating safety hazards that compound existing survival challenges. Children develop nightmares about permanent darkness, while adults develop paranoia about neighbors stealing their last candle. creating household atmospheres where fear dominates every interaction and trust becomes a luxury nobody can afford. You watch families torn apart by suspicion as family members become convinced that each other are hoarding supplies, making secret deals, or not contributing fairly to survival efforts. The social bonds that held communities together during early crisis stages dissolve under psychological pressure that makes cooperation feel dangerous rather than beneficial. Remember that bone pain and muscle weakness you had from vitamin D deficiency? Yes, it got worse, much worse. Prolonged sun deprivation has reached levels that cause serious skeletal and immune system damage. The bone aches have progressed to severe pain that makes basic movement difficult, while your immune system becomes so compromised that minor injuries could easily turn into life-threatening infections. You experience joint problems, dental issues, and muscle spasms that transform simple tasks into exercises in pain management. After 18 months of this seemingly endless nightmare, the sky starts looking less dimmed. You're not sure if your mind is playing tricks on you, but as time passes, it keeps getting a bit brighter, and people are getting more hopeful that the worst is about to pass. Little did you know that's not what's happening at all. Yes, the sky gets slightly brighter, but nothing else improves. It's been over a year since the sky began brightening. It wasn't as bright as normal blue skies, but bright enough to give you false hope that recovery was finally beginning. You soon realized it didn't get any warmer and agriculture remained as hopeless as it had been for the past few years. At least things weren't getting worse, right? Wrong. 540 CE delivers a second volcanic eruption like a follow-up gut punch after the first finishing blow has already landed, which is an overkill because you were already falling down. Temperature drops another 2.7 degrees Celsius because apparently the first round of perpetual winter wasn't deadly enough. You watch the sky darken again just as communities thought they were seeing improvement, crushing whatever optimism had built up during months of slightly brighter conditions. Although the sky never got as dark as the first time around, the second eruption proves more devastating because it strikes populations already weakened by years of starvation, disease, and psychological exhaustion, creating compound disasters that almost exceed human ability to adapt or recover. Hope gets systematically murdered just as communities thought they'd figured out how to survive in perpetual winter hellscape, destroying the mental resilience that kept people functioning during the worst periods of the initial crisis. You experience the psychological devastation of watching your survival strategies face challenges bigger than they were designed for, as the second volcanic winter demands more than existing techniques can provide. The cruel timing of the second eruption transforms hope from dangerous luxury into active liability, as people who dared to believe in recovery now face deeper despair than those who never allowed themselves optimism in the first place. 4-year veterans of apocalypse survival face renewed catastrophe, with the enthusiasm of marathon runners being told they need to run another marathon immediately after finishing the first one. The survival knowledge you've gained remains valuable, just not quite enough for these new conditions. The universe demonstrates that just when you think you've hit rock bottom, there's always a basement level of suffering. It's like you're a gamer thinking clearing nightmare mode would finish the game for good. Instead, you just unlocked hell mode you didn't know existed. You now realize that surviving the first volcanic winter only qualified you for advanced level catastrophe, where previous disasters become foundation for facing even worse conditions that test the absolute limits of human endurance. People who'd adapted to permanent winter now face a much worse upgrade, if that's even possible. The second volcanic winter creates conditions that make the first disaster look like a practice round, pushing temperatures to levels that challenge even the most experienced survivors. What seemed like the worst possible circumstances now become the good old days compared to this enhanced frozen nightmare that tests whether human persistence has any actual limits. On the cold and hunger front, nothing seems to be getting worse. Even though 536 kicked off what would later be known as the Late Antique Little Ice Age, which would last 124 years. But that's just more of the same. Here's the real curveball 536 threw at humanity. It created perfect conditions for an outbreak that would continue in waves for over 2 centuries. Ah, yes, the infamous Plague of Justinian has arrived to populations already running on fumes, malnutrition, and spite, creating the perfect storm where multiple disasters converge to test whether humans can actually survive everything nature throws at them simultaneously. While survivors of 5 years of volcanic winter were figuring out how to rebuild civilization, they were also unknowingly building a medieval Amazon delivery network for death. Trade networks that survived the climate apocalypse were now desperately moving grain from Egypt to feed Constantinople's remaining population. Because apparently nobody learned that depending entirely on foreign food imports during a crisis might have some drawbacks. These grain ships weren't just carrying food relief, they were also carrying black rats who considered the stored grain an all-you-can-eat buffet with accommodations. The rats weren't traveling alone. They brought fleas infected with Yersinia pestis. Sounds familiar? That's right. It's the same bacterium responsible for the Black Death, and it had been waiting patiently in Central Asian mountains for the perfect moment to go on a Mediterranean cruise. Constantinople had become a 300,000 to 500,000 person metropolis, completely dependent on Egyptian grain imports, creating a medieval version of just-in-time delivery that was about to experience the worst supply chain disruption in human history. The government guaranteed sufficient grain reached the city, creating massive warehouses that provided perfect breeding grounds for rats and fleas crucial to plague transmission. While rats generally don't travel more than 200 meters from their birthplaces, once aboard grain boats, they were carried throughout the empire like unwilling international plague distributors, turning homebody rodents into bioterrorists. Egyptian port of Pelusium reported plague outbreak in 541 CE, spreading north to Alexandria and east to Palestine, basically announcing to the Mediterranean world that death was coming to visit everyone personally. The plague didn't sneak up on anybody. It sent a clear message from Egypt saying, "Prepare for the worst." John of Ephesus noted that people of Constantinople were aware of the plague for 2 years before it reached the city, but made no effort to prepare themselves for its arrival. This proves that humans have always been excellent at ignoring obvious disasters until they're personally inconvenient. The Byzantine government, fresh off managing volcanic winter crisis, apparently looked at reports of mass death approaching and decided their current problems were sufficient entertainment. Grain imports continued normally because stopping food shipments would cause immediate starvation. You can't quarantine against plague when quarantine means certain death by starvation for hundreds of thousands of people who depend on foreign grain. The imperial government faced impossible mathematics: maintain trade and risk plague, or stop trade and guarantee famine. By 542 CE, when spring arrived in Constantinople, residents were probably thinking, finally, a normal year after surviving volcanic winter, starvation, and social collapse. Spring meant warmer weather, longer days, and the psychological relief of having endured the worst possible combination of disasters. You could almost hear the collective sigh of relief as people emerged from underground shelters and heated rooms, believing they'd survived everything nature could throw at them. The optimism was understandable, but tragically premature, because the universe had been saving its cruelest joke for last. Emperor Justinian had just finished spending massive amounts of money conquering North Africa from Vandals and Italy from Ostrogoths, basically rebuilding the Roman Empire through military excellence and financial exhaustion. The Reconquest campaigns drained imperial resources during volcanic winter recovery, creating the worst possible timing for a pandemic. He'd also invested heavily in construction projects like Hagia Sophia, because apparently the best time to build magnificent churches is right before God decides to test your faith with unprecedented mass death. These public works projects created dense urban populations that plague loves most, turning architectural achievements into perfect epidemic conditions. The empire was running on economic fumes from war expenses and volcanic winter recovery, making it about as prepared for a pandemic as a diabetic is prepared for a candy avalanche. Procopius noted that citizens could barely afford to feed themselves before plague arrived. Justinian's court historian Procopius was documenting glorious military campaigns, completely unaware he was about to become history's most reluctant plague correspondent. The transition from chronicling military victories to documenting mass graves happened so quickly that Procopius barely had time to adjust his writing style from celebration to horror. By 542 CE, Justinian had successfully reconquered most of his empire, creating maximum population density and trade connectivity right when plague decided to make its entrance. The unified Mediterranean trading network that distributed goods now efficiently distributed disease-carrying rats throughout the empire. Spring 542 brought the usual grain shipments from Egypt to Constantinople. Except this time, the cargo manifest included complementary rats, fleas, and enough plague bacteria to kill half the known world. Think of it as medieval Amazon Prime delivery, but instead of your package being delayed, civilization gets canceled. These weren't just any rats. These were rats who had been living their best life in Egyptian granaries, breeding enthusiastically while developing a taste for international travel and inadvertent bioterrorism. They'd spent months in all-you-can-eat buffets, getting fat and happy, while their flea roommates picked up some interesting bacterial hitchhickers. The fleas on these rats were carrying Yersinia pestis, a bacterium that had originated in the Tian Shan Mountains, but decided Constantinople looked like a more exciting vacation destination. It had been waiting patiently in Central Asian rodent colonies for the perfect moment to go on a Mediterranean cruise. Once these floating death traps docked, Constantinople's grain warehouses became medieval plague factories. Picture perfect breeding grounds for rats and fleas, with the added bonus of being connected directly to the city's food distribution system. It was like setting up biological weapons labs inside grocery stores, except nobody realized they were doing it. William Rosen notes that rats generally don't travel more than 200 meters from their birthplaces. They're homebodies who prefer familiar neighborhoods. But once aboard the grain boats, these rats were carried throughout the empire, essentially turning introverted rodents into unwilling international plague distributors. The shy rat next door suddenly became patient zero for 3 continents. The whole system was beautifully efficient in the worst possible way. Egypt's government maintained massive granaries as state infrastructure for empire-wide distribution. Bad weather closed the Mediterranean to shipping from November to March, requiring enormous storage facilities in Constantinople. Some warehouses were 90 feet by 280 feet and ineffably tall, basically rat apartment complexes with room service. And rats, while they'll eat just about anything, grain is their favorite meal. So Constantinople had built the perfect plague delivery system. Rat paradise connected to human food supplies, staffed by people who had no idea they were running death factories. It was like designing a bioweapon by accident, which is probably the most human way to destroy civilization. Emperor Justinian himself contracted the plague in 542 because apparently ruling during volcanic winter and economic collapse wasn't challenging enough without adding personal near-death experiences. It's like being the captain of a sinking ship while also drowning, except the ship is civilization, and you're supposed to save everyone else first. Procopius recorded that Justinian contracted the disease and recovered, which must have made for awkward dinner conversation. "How was your day, dear?" "Oh, nearly died of plague, but the Ostrogoths are still a problem." Just another Tuesday in the Byzantine court, where imperial small talk included mortality updates. The emperor's survival was remarkable considering that plague was killing thousands daily. This suggests either divine intervention, excellent medical care, or pure imperial stubbornness, refusing to let bacteria ruin his empire-building plans. Justinian had spent too much money conquering territories to let microscopic invaders take them back without a fight. While Justinian recovered, his first-hand experience gave him intimate knowledge of exactly how terrible plague was. This probably influenced his subsequent mass grave digging policies, because nothing motivates emergency sanitation measures like personally experiencing the disease that's creating the corpse overflow problem. The emperor's illness occurred at the height of the epidemic, which killed about a fifth of Constantinople's population. He got plague during the absolute worst possible timing, like having a heart attack in the middle of a hospital evacuation. But somehow he survived, which was either incredibly lucky or incredibly unfair, depending on your perspective as a dying peasant. Procopius recorded that at its peak, the plague was killing 10,000 people in Constantinople daily, though modern historians think 5,000 to 7,000 is more realistic, because apparently medieval people exaggerated death tolls, unlike modern people who would never inflate numbers for dramatic effect. John of Ephesus provided specific daily counts, 5,000 and 7,000, or even 12,000, and as many as 16,000 of them departed this world in a single day. This suggests that medieval accountants were either very precise or very creative with their record-keeping, depending on how you feel about mathematical consistency during apocalypses. Bodies were left stacked in the open because burial capacity had been exceeded like a medieval version of server overload. Except the crashed system was civilization itself, and you couldn't just restart it by turning it off and on again. The city's infrastructure had hit its corpse processing limit. Funeral rites were often left unattended to, and the entire city smelled like the dead. This created an atmosphere that combined the spiritual comfort of abandoned religious ceremonies with the aromatic appeal of a medieval morgue. Imagine trying to maintain normal daily routines while breathing air that reminded you constantly that everyone was dying. The plague lasted about 4 months in Constantinople, with the period of peak virulence lasting 3 months. Even pandemics had deadlines, though these were more literal than most. After 4 months of non-stop death, Constantinople had transformed from imperial capital to open-air cemetery, with a few survivors wandering around looking confused. Because there was no room to bury the dead, authorities had to get creative with body disposal, like medieval waste management specialists, facing their worst possible professional challenge. When your job description suddenly includes figure out what to do with thousands of corpses daily, you learn to think outside the traditional grave. Emperor Justinian ordered troops to assist in the disposal of the dead, because apparently military service during plague years included surprise career transitions from soldier to professional corpse hauler. These men had signed up to fight Goths and Vandals, not to play deadly Tetris with human remains in city streets. Once the graveyards and tombs were filled, burial pits and trenches were dug to handle the overflow. Constantinople's first mass grave infrastructure project probably wasn't what city planners had in mind for urban development. They were essentially strip mining the earth in reverse, creating enormous holes to fill with people instead of digging up resources. When burial pits overflowed, bodies were stuffed into the towers of the city walls with quicklime poured over them to speed up decomposition. They were repurposing defensive architecture as medieval crematoria because apparently city walls needed career changes too. These towers had been built to keep enemies out, not to store dead citizens. Some corpses were loaded onto ships that were pushed out into the Sea of Marmara and set alight. Floating funeral pyres probably confused any surviving sailors about whether they were witnessing religious ceremonies or maritime disasters. The sea became a graveyard with occasional fireworks, courtesy of burning death boats drifting across the horizon. The entire city smelled like the dead, because proper waste management becomes challenging when your waste includes several thousand human corpses daily, and your waste management workers keep dying. It's hard to maintain sanitation standards when the sanitation department has been decimated by the thing they're supposed to clean up. Constantinople's air quality combined the aromatic appeal of rotting flesh with the cultural sophistication of a city where funeral rites could not properly be observed. Essentially medieval aromatherapy designed by death itself. Every breath reminded residents that civilization had broken down at the most basic level. The stench became so overwhelming that even survivors who hadn't caught plague were probably questioning whether death might be preferable to breathing. When the air itself becomes a constant reminder of mortality, normal life becomes impossible. You couldn't escape the smell by going indoors, because buildings were also being used for body storage. Buildings used for body storage added architectural variety to the cityscape, transforming Constantinople into a metropolis where residential, commercial, and mortuary districts merged into one unified zone of horror. Property values probably weren't a major concern when every neighborhood doubled as a graveyard. The smell situation got so bad that bodies were disposed of in buildings, dumped into the sea, and placed on boats for burials at sea. When traditional waste management fails, creativity becomes a survival skill. Unfortunately, some of these creative solutions, like dumping bodies in the sea, just moved the smell problem around rather than solving it. Work of every description ceased, and all the trades were abandoned by the artisans. Because it's hard to maintain professional productivity when your customers, coworkers, and possibly yourself might be dead by lunch. The concept of showing up to work becomes meaningless when there's nobody left to serve and nobody left to pay you. Traditional businesses discovered that all other work as well, such as each had in hand, became irrelevant when survival replaced commerce as the primary economic activity. Blacksmiths stopped making horseshoes, bakers stopped baking bread, and merchants stopped merchanting. The entire concept of specialized labor collapsed when everyone's job became try not to die. In a city which was simply abounding in all good things, starvation almost absolute was running riot. This created the medieval equivalent of supply chain disruption, where warehouses full of goods couldn't reach customers because everyone involved in distribution was dead. Food existed, but the people who knew how to get it from storage to tables had inconveniently died of plague. Constantinople's markets became dysfunctional not because of lack of goods, but because it seemed a difficult and very notable thing to have a sufficiency of bread or of anything else when bread sellers kept dying mid-transaction. Commerce requires live participants, and Plague had strong opinions about participant mortality rates. The economy transitioned from monetary exchange to survival bartering, where the most valuable currency became still being alive, and traditional pricing models proved inadequate for apocalyptic market conditions. When your entire customer base might be dead tomorrow, long-term business planning becomes rather pointless. Constantinople residents had already survived 5 years of volcanic winter and were psychologically prepared for hardship. Except plague made previous suffering look like practice rounds for the real horror show. They thought they'd graduated from the University of Human Misery, only to discover they'd just finished the introductory course. Survivors developed emotional numbness as a coping mechanism, because processing grief for thousands of daily deaths would have required full-time emotional labor that interfered with staying alive. When mourning becomes a luxury you can't afford, human psychology adapts by simply shutting down the grief processing department. The psychological impact of constant death created societies where normal mourning became impossible, transforming grief from personal experience into background environmental condition. Sadness became like the weather, always present, rarely discussed, and completely beyond anyone's control. Children who had already lived through 5 years of climate apocalypse now witnessed adult caregivers dying from invisible disease. This created childhood trauma that probably influenced medieval worldviews about the essential hostility of existence. These kids learned early that the universe was personally invested in making life miserable. Adults found themselves making daily survival calculations that included probability assessments about their own mortality, creating a demographic where actuarial thinking became basic life skills. Every morning involved calculating the odds of making it to evening, which is not typically considered essential mathematics education. Imperial bureaucrats showed up to jobs governing empty cities, creating surreal administrative situations where paperwork continued while the populations being administered had died. Government offices became monuments to bureaucratic persistence, with clerks dutifully maintaining records for districts that no longer contained living taxpayers. Tax revenues declined through the massive number of deaths and the disruption of agriculture and trade, because dead people proved surprisingly uncooperative about paying taxes. Unlike living people who only complain about it, the imperial treasury discovered that corpses make terrible contributors to government funding, no matter how sternly you ask. Justinian swiftly enacted new legislation to deal more efficiently with the glut of inheritance suits being brought as a result of victims dying intestate. Even during apocalypse, lawyers found ways to stay busy. When everyone dies without wills, the legal profession experiences unprecedented job security through bureaucratic chaos. The emperor's financial situation went from expensive wars and building projects to expensive wars and building projects plus nobody alive to pay for them. This created imperial budget problems that made modern deficit spending look fiscally responsible. Justinian had successfully achieved the economic nightmare of maximum expenses with minimum taxpayers. Farmers couldn't tend their crops and grain prices skyrocketed in Constantinople because agricultural work requires live farmers. And plague had strong opinions about farmer mortality rates. When your workforce keeps dying, crop management becomes challenging in ways that agricultural manuals don't typically address. Rural areas experienced complete agricultural breakdown as plague devastated farming communities across the empire, leaving fields unworked and livestock unattended. Cows don't milk themselves, and wheat doesn't harvest itself, despite what city people might optimistically believe. The disruption of food production created famine on top of plague, proving that disasters prefer traveling in groups rather than visiting individually like polite guests. Stored grain rotted in warehouses, while the people who knew how to distribute it lay dead in the streets, creating the odd circumstance of having food and starving at the same time. Surviving urban populations faced the delightful combination of plague, starvation, and economic collapse. This medieval triple threat made previous problems seem quaintly manageable. Constantinople residents probably looked back fondly on the days when they only had unusually dark and long winters to worry about. Agricultural labor shortage meant that even surviving farmland couldn't be worked, creating food security problems that extended far beyond the plague's direct mortality. Empty fields became monuments to dead farmers, creating landscapes that looked like agricultural ghost towns. Soldiers died in massive numbers or deserted the army to avoid infection, because military service during plague offered the exciting career opportunity of combat death plus disease death. When your job already involves people trying to kill you, adding invisible bacterial assassins makes military recruitment surprisingly unappealing. Justinian's recent military successes in reconquering North Africa and Italy became strategically meaningless when the armies responsible for holding these territories either died or abandoned their posts. Conquest requires live soldiers, and the plague did not seem to agree with that plan. Imperial expansion became difficult when your expansion forces kept contracting faster than any experienced general could adapt, creating military logistics problems that weren't covered in strategic planning manuals. The war against the Goths in Italy dragged on much longer than anticipated, partly because plague had decimated the army. This proved that bacteria don't respect military timetables or strategic planning. The Goths probably appreciated the bacterial assistance, if it weren't for the fact that those same bacteria also killed plenty of their own men. The Byzantine military discovered that plague was an equal opportunity employer, hiring both their own troops and the enemy's. Tactical victories started going to whichever side had fewer corpses, not better strategy. Military excellence took a back seat to bacterial immunity. Constantinople's urban services failed not through administrative incompetence, but through administrator mortality, creating service interruptions that made modern utility outages seem like minor inconveniences. When your entire municipal workforce dies, even basic city functions become impossible to maintain. Law and order broke down because law enforcement requires live law enforcers, and plague treated police officers with the same fatal courtesy it showed everyone else. Criminal justice became irrelevant when both criminals and judges were equally likely to die before trial proceedings could be completed. Waste management systems designed for normal human waste proved inadequate for massive human corpse disposal, creating sanitation challenges that combined traditional sewage problems with novel body disposal logistics. City planners had never anticipated needing to manage thousands of dead bodies daily alongside regular garbage collection. Water distribution systems continued functioning physically, but lacked personnel to maintain them, creating infrastructure paradoxes where services worked, but nobody was alive to operate them. Aqueducts still carried water, but the people who knew how to repair them when something broke had inconveniently died. Urban planning concepts like residential districts and commercial districts became irrelevant when district populations died and city zoning became primarily about separating living areas from corpse storage areas. The plague didn't politely end after destroying Constantinople. It continued to recur until the middle of the 8th century, because apparently one apocalyptic pandemic wasn't sufficient entertainment for the universe. Just when survivors thought they could start rebuilding, the plague arrived again to destroy their short-lived optimism. Frequent subsequent waves of the plague continued to strike throughout the 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries, creating a medieval subscription service for death that nobody had ordered. Communities would barely start recovering when the next wave arrived, making long-term planning pointless and survival a recurring challenge. Evagrius Scholasticus, a Syrian historian, survived the initial plague as a child, but during the disease's 4 returns in his lifetime, he lost his wife, a daughter and her child, other children, most of his servants, and people from his country estate. The plague essentially stalked his family for decades, proving that it never went away. It just sat there waiting for the next round of assault. Each wave killed different populations as survivors from previous waves had developed some immunity, creating cyclical demographic catastrophes that prevented long-term population recovery. It was like a deadly lottery where winning meant you got to participate in the next drawing. The recurring pattern meant that just as communities began rebuilding, plague would return to destroy progress. This created a medieval version of Sisyphus rolling a boulder uphill. Except the boulder was made of dead bodies and kept rolling back down every few years. The outbreak continued to sweep throughout the Mediterranean world for another 225 years, finally disappearing in 750. The plague had essentially become a permanent resident of the Mediterranean. The disease became more localized and less virulent over time, suggesting that plague learned to pace itself for maximum long-term impact, rather than burning out quickly through excessive initial enthusiasm. Even bacteria apparently understood the benefits of sustainable business practices. Communities that survived multiple waves developed cultural adaptations that normalized plague as part of regular life, creating societies where pandemic preparedness became as routine as seasonal agricultural planning. The plague became just another seasonal concern that required practical preparation. The persistent nature of recurring plague meant that children born after 541 grew up in societies where mass death was normal background condition rather than exceptional crisis. For generations of people, plague wasn't a disaster, it was just Tuesday. By 750, when the plague finally disappeared, it had been present for over 200 years. That's longer than most political dynasties and long enough to shape cultural memory for generations. Plague became a permanent feature of medieval consciousness, like weather or taxes, except deadlier. Total death toll estimates range from 25 million to 100 million people during the 200-year pandemic period, representing 25 to 60% of Europe's population at the time of the first outbreak. These numbers are so large they become abstract, but imagine half your neighbors disappearing permanently. These mortality rates created population bottlenecks that influenced European genetic diversity for centuries, essentially creating evolutionary pressure through bacterial intervention. The plague didn't just kill people, it changed the genetic makeup of entire populations by eliminating certain family lines completely. Labor shortages lasted for generations because replacing 25 to 60% of a population requires time that medieval reproductive rates and child mortality couldn't provide quickly. You can't just hire more workers when most of the workers are dead and their children died too. Economic recovery also took centuries because of this very same reason. Recurring plague waves made the bounce back excruciatingly slow. Every time populations started growing again, another plague wave would arrive to reset the demographic clock. The demographic collapse had profound economic, social, and political effects across Europe and the Near East, creating changes that influenced medieval European development for centuries. The plague essentially rewrote the demographic map of an entire continent. Survivors developed cultural practices around pandemic management that influenced European responses to later disease outbreaks, creating institutional knowledge about managing mass death. They learned how to dig mass graves efficiently, which is not the kind of expertise any civilization wants to develop. Religious interpretations of the plague as divine punishment became standard theological explanations for disaster, influencing medieval Christianity's relationship with suffering and mortality. God's wrath became the default explanation for mass death, which probably didn't improve anyone's faith. The plague's impact on Eastern Roman society created cultural changes that distinguished post-plague Byzantine culture from pre-plague Roman culture, essentially creating new civilizational identity through shared trauma. The Byzantine Empire that emerged after the plague was fundamentally different from the Roman Empire that existed before it. Medieval historical consciousness was shaped by plague experience, creating worldviews that expected periodic catastrophic mortality as normal rather than exceptional. People stopped being surprised when everyone died horribly, which is a pretty depressing adjustment to human expectations. Survivors found themselves starting human civilization from scratch. Again, they've lost count how many times. The few remaining people had to rebuild not just buildings and institutions, but entire ways of life that had been completely destroyed. The combination of climate disaster followed by pandemic-created conditions, where rebuilding meant accepting that previous normal was permanently unavailable rather than temporarily interrupted. There was no going back to how things were before 536. Too much had changed, and too many people had died. The few remaining institutions had to adapt to governing populations that were demographically, economically, and psychologically different from pre-disaster societies. Ruling half-empty cities requires different skills than governing thriving populations. Post-plague societies operated with labor shortages, economic disruption, and cultural trauma that created new normal conditions fundamentally different from pre-541 civilizations. Entire economic systems had to be rebuilt around the reality that most skilled workers were dead. Political structures adapted to governing smaller, traumatized populations with different economic needs and social expectations than pre-plague societies. The plague contributed to the demise of Justinian's reign not through political opposition, but through biological destruction of the empire he was trying to rebuild. The volcanic winter of 536, followed by the plague of 541, shows how human resilience redefines the impossible. Centuries of compounded disasters tried to erase hope, but they failed. We survived as a species. People endured frozen starvation in perpetual twilight, watched half their neighbors die, rebuilt civilization multiple times, and somehow kept going. That's not just survival. That's stubborn human refusal to give up even when the universe seems personally invested in destroying everything. If you're still here after learning about humanity's worst decade, congratulations on surviving this historical horror show. Let me know if 536 to 541 makes your current problems seem manageable, or if you're now questioning why anyone chooses to study medieval history for fun.